Hello everyone. Okay, we're back again to follow up on our video series regarding the history of America and Iran. Quite the bad history. And today we're going to be doing part 3, picking up from where we left off yesterday. Of course, yesterday we left off with President Eisenhower being elected in 1952. And of course, the situation at that point was that the British government had realized that they weren't getting anywhere with Truman. So now that Eisenhower had become president, the first thing they did was they sent one of their high-level British spies to America to have a conversation with Eisenhower. And in this conversation, this British spy told Eisenhower that the British government and British intelligence feared that Mossadegh had communist sympathies, maybe a communist, maybe leaning communist, and that was their major issue. He did not bring up anything about the issue with the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. He just advised Eisenhower that they were thinking that Mossadegh may be a communist. Of course, Eisenhower was getting a lot of different types of information because a lot of the people who were there at the CIA under Truman, who had been working on the Iran issue and had studied Mossadegh pretty closely, they were telling Eisenhower that no, he was not really a communist. In fact, he was very outspoken about being a rabid anti-communist. So Eisenhower was being told both that Mossadegh may be a communist or that he was not a communist. So I'm not really sure why all this was being done, but we do know that the British intelligence and the CIA were meeting privately, we have to assume without the knowledge of Eisenhower, during the transition period and right after he came into office. We also know that 5 or 6 of the big oil companies had met with some people at the CIA and with British intelligence. So it looks like they were trying to do 2 things. Number one, work out some sort of a plan that they believed that Eisenhower might accept, and they were probably also trying to find a way to play into Eisenhower's fears or sympathies, and that would, number one on that list would have been communism, because of course we had just entered into the new Cold War. So a lot of angles are being played behind the scenes at this point. And Eisenhower, of course, I'm sure was somewhat pretty well briefed on the situation in Iran. Even though he hadn't been president, he was campaigning for president. I'm sure he was watching and paying attention to the events that were unfolding in Iran in regards to the British Oil Company, and I'm sure he understood exactly what the main reason was that that the British wanted to take some sort of action in Iran, and we have to assume that they wanted military action because they were coming to the United States, and they probably felt they would have needed at least US support, if not assistance with the military operations. But it appears that Eisenhower did not want to take military actions, not covert military actions. But what he did do was he did go along with applying sanctions and a boycott of the Iranian oil. And this was probably to pressure Mossadegh into relinquishing control of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Of course, Mossadegh, he did not give in, but the sanctions and the boycotts turned out to be extremely effective. In fact, possibly far too effective for Eisenhower's liking, because it didn't take long before the Iranian economy was in shambles. They could not export any oil, and they were bleeding red ink very, very badly. Now, as the situation played out, eventually Eisenhower became very concerned that because the situation in Iran, the economic situation due to the boycott, had seriously weakened the Iranian economy and was weakening Mossadegh himself, that this might open the door for possibly a communist takeover. And this is really the rationale that the Eisenhower administration would use to satisfy their decision to move forward with a covert operation to take down the government of, or at least ways take out Mossadegh. Not necessarily take down the government, but take Mossadegh out of the government and replace him with someone that they preferred, which would, of course, that would be, of course, the Shah. Okay, so as the events are playing out, eventually Eisenhower decides that something's going to have to be done. Now, there was a last-ditch effort by Mossadegh to try to resolve the situation, and he had sent a letter to Eisenhower advising Eisenhower of a deal he was prepared to make. And that deal was that if Eisenhower would end the boycotts and end the sanctions, that Mossadegh and Iran would sell oil to the United States at a 40% discount. And he also stated that if that did not happen, that the Iranians would be left with no choice but to sell to the Soviet Union. And Mossadegh really didn't want to do that because he really didn't like the communists. He didn't want to get in bed with him, but at the same time, it's the only country that he could export oil to and go around the sanctions and the boycott. And it was desperate. Their situation was desperate. He really had no choice. Either Eisenhower was going to have to back down, accept the discount, and work with Mossadegh and the Iranians to resolve the situation, or he would have to go and sell to the Soviet Union. So at this point, this was pretty much the final straw. Eisenhower rejected that overture by Mossadegh, which meant that Mossadegh probably understood that that was probably the end of the road and that things were going to get much tougher. And for Eisenhower, that told him that this was clearly proof that the situation in Iran was desperate, and that in fact he was now going to probably sell oil to the Soviet Union, which would mean that they would have a closer relationship, which would maybe invite communist influence into Iran and possibly other regions, other countries in the region. And that was the final straw. And that is when Eisenhower went ahead and gave the okay for the operation. But before doing so, he had to make sure that he got something. And really, it's not that Eisenhower got something, but one thing we do know is that when these big oil companies, Standard Oil and Royal Dutch Shell and some of the others, had gotten together with the British intelligence and the CIA to discuss various things, it became very apparent to the British intelligence agencies, probably because the CIA told them that, look, if you're going to get Eisenhower to go along with it, you're going to have to offer him something, because, you know, Truman wouldn't go along with it because he didn't see anything in it for him, and Eisenhower was the same way. You know, this was just a pebble in his shoe he didn't want to have to deal with, but he was being forced to deal with it anyway. But there was no great incentive for him to do it because he was getting nothing out of the deal. But now, with the British government realizing that they were going to have to give up something, they came up with a plan to share substantial amounts of the oil revenues with these other oil companies, 4 of them being American oil companies and 1 of them being Royal Dutch Shell, a Dutch company. So this is really what brought us to the point where Eisenhower gave the thumbs up to the operation. Now, there were 2 operations. The British had an operation and the CIA had an operation to take out Mossadegh. So they put the 2 operations together and they formed one operation, which was called Operation Ajax. Operation Ajax was an operation to take out Mossadegh and to reinstall first a military general to stabilize the situation, and then to roll out the Shah, bring back the Shah, and then to give him complete monarchical, king-like powers. So, there were really 4 parts to this plan to take down Mossadegh. The first part was to begin a massive propaganda campaign, and the propaganda campaign will be designed to spread information throughout the region, and particularly in Iran and really all around the world, that Mossadegh was a communist. Number two was to create the within the opposition, those opposed to Mossadegh, and to carry out disturbances and chaos. And this involved a lot of things that I won't go into detail in, but there was false flag operations, there were mob hitmen brought in, there were massive protests and demonstrations, all of this arranged and orchestrated by the CIA and British intelligence. Next was to get with the Shah of Iran and to persuade him to remove Mossadegh, because he essentially had the authority to do so. He just hadn't done it. And I don't really know why he hadn't, but certainly pressure had been brought to bear on him. But at this point, the CIA and British intelligence were going to go to the Shah and tell him, hey, we really want you to, at the right time when we tell you to fire or get rid of Mossadegh. And this is once they felt that their propaganda campaign and their street chaos and disruptions had reached, full peak. And then at the right time, they were going to have the Shah come out and say, okay, things are out of control, Mossadegh has to go. And that was how it was supposed to play out, so that it would look natural or organic. Finally, the Shah was to not to say, I'm coming back into power, but to appoint someone else to replace Mossadegh, and this man was a general named Zahedi. Now, once Zahedi, who was also involved in the plot, once Zahedi calmed down the situation and the other parts of the operation played themselves out, then he essentially would have the Shah come back in and assume total monarchical or king-like powers. So, in March of 1953, the order was given to carry out Operation Ajax. The operation was carried out. It was successful. And that was the end of Mossadegh. This brought the Shah back into power. The deal with Mossadegh is that he was arrested. He was put in jail for 3 years and then placed on house arrest and lived in Iran and lived out his life there under house arrest. I believe he passed away in 78 or 79. So, this was really a major achievement for the CIA, because remember, the CIA was only 5 years old at this point. And so it was the first major covert operation that was highly successful, or viewed as highly successful at that time, because they essentially took down a foreign leader without ever having to use the military or do anything like that. It was done totally with a covert operation, through intelligence, through propaganda, and things like that. And so, because the CIA viewed this as a major success, this became the format that the Central Intelligence Agency would use to overthrow and depose many leaders and overthrow many governments in the coming years in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, including, of course, the very well-known coups in Guatemala and Chile and other places. So this takes us now to 1953. The coup's been successful. Mossadegh is gone. The Shah of Iran comes back into power with complete monarchical, king-like powers, and he begins to govern in a way that would set the stage for the next major bad event, which would be the thing that would finally poison relations between the United States and Iran and take us to the point where we are today. But certainly the coup in 1953, while it looked organic to the rest of the world, and while it was played off as being an organic situation, and that the Central Intelligence Agency and the government of the United States and the British government denied having any role in the events that played out there, of course, we all know they were lying. And of course, the CIA has come out and admitted that in fact they did take part in the coup, as well as the British government. Of course, many government officials and presidents have all admitted, it's now publicly acknowledged, that we did overthrow the government of Iran in 1953. We took down a secular democratic reformer who was not a radical jihadist or anything like that. He was a democratic type secular leader, and we took him out and we replaced him with a despotic dictator, the Shah. And this would prove to be probably the best example if you've heard the term blowback and you want to really understand the term blowback and understand what it means and the consequences of blowback. There's probably no better example of the coup of Iran in 1953. So I think we'll go ahead and leave it off at this point for today. So this is where we are now. Eisenhower's the president. The coup's been successful. The Shah's back in power, and most of the world believes that this was just a natural reaction. Of course, the people inside Iran, especially the supporters of Mossadegh, understood very well that the entire thing was some sort of a covert operation that took down Mossadegh. And I imagine many people in countries around the Middle East knew this as well. You know, what the media tells us and what people believe is two different things. So whether or not Americans or Europeans or others around the world believed the story that it was an organic uprising and overthrow of Mossadegh, certainly the people of Iran and people probably around the Middle East understood exactly what that was, and that would certainly fester and would certainly play a part in the events that transpired in the future. And that's what we'll be getting to next. Okay, so I'll come back tomorrow. We'll do another video. We'll move into the next segment of the relationship between the United States and Iran and where all that went wrong. And you can certainly call the coup of 1953 of being the first really major bad thing that happened that began the very bad relations between the United States and Iran. It is this event in 1953 that Iranians will bring up if you get into a conversation with them. And it's kind of funny, you know, you'll see journalists sometimes who will go over to Iran and they'll do, you know, documentaries, and they'll interview Iranians on the street, and they'll ask them about their government and how they feel about the government and all that. Of course, it's maybe a little risky as an Iranian citizen to go on camera in a documentary and maybe say exactly what you think, but many of them are a lot more candid than what you might think. I was a little surprised at some of the responses I've seen from Iranians interviewed on the street and how much they'll actually say about how they feel about their government or other governments and Americans and things like that. But it is funny because it was a couple people who were being interviewed by a journalist in a documentary I was watching, and he was asking them about, you know, how they would like to have, you know, would they like to have a democratic form of government. And it was quite funny to hear two or three of the people who were asked look at the journalist like he was crazy and say, well, you know, we actually did democratically elect a prime minister who was a democratic reformer and who was not an Islamicist. And the United States and the British government overthrew him, and they gave us an evil dictator. So it was the United States and the British who killed democracy in Iran in 1953. So anyway, we'll leave it there, and I'll get back to you tomorrow, and we'll get started on the next chapter in this sordid tale. So you all have a good day. Give me a thumbs up if you like the video, and share it with your friends. Subscribe if you'd like. And I'll get back to you tomorrow, and we'll continue on. Alrighty, goodbye.